Well, your dreams have come true. Someone is going to spend a few minutes explaining to you some important facts about the Korean War, and who hasn't spent ages dreaming for just that opportunity. At any rate, the Korean War began in 1950, but to really understand what's going on in the Korean War, it's important that we go back a little further in time to a different country, and that country was China. China had been experiencing years of strife between nationalist and communist forces, and the United States was kind of in a difficult situation regarding that conflict because a lot of Americans didn't think that we necessarily needed to invest a whole lot of money and military power in China. And so we wanted the nationalists to win. We tolerated corrupt nationalist leadership, but we didn't exactly do a whole lot to help them win. And sure enough, by 1948-49, the communists were winning and then had in fact taken over mainland China. Now that's not just important because it sets us up for the Korean War in terms of why the United States was so desperate to make sure that communism didn't spread into South Korea. It's also going to answer an important question about how the United States was able to do so under UN auspices. So, as I said, the communists have taken over mainland China. The nationalists have fled to a little island called Taiwan. And there was immediately an international dispute over what actually constituted China. To Mao Zedong and the communist Chinese allies in the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, the answer is quite simple. Mainland China was China, and it was now a communist country. However, for the United States and the West, this was not a legitimate government. It had come to power through civil war and force, and so we tried to act as though the real legitimate government of China was a little island off the coast of China, Taiwan, where the nationalist forces had set up camp. This is important because when the UN decided to follow American influence and recognize Taiwan as China, the Soviet Union decided to boycott UN activities and therefore was not present for important meetings of the UN Security Council. Please remember that the Soviet Union was not present when the UN Security Council was meeting. Meeting in 1950 when, despite the best efforts of US containment policy, communist troops from North Korea crossed the 38th parallel, trying to spread communism into South Korea and unify the entire Korean peninsula as a communist country. Now, this was alarming to many Americans, but it was also important to many of our allies because the world was really, I think, pretty curious about whether the United States was willing to back up its commitment to contain the spread of communism and even to find out just to what extents we were willing to go to back up that containment policy. Well, this was an international crisis, and so even though the United States was very, very much concerned about what was going on, the United Nations held a meeting of its Security Council to decide what to do. And the vote was to send a UN force into South Korea to try to defend South Korean interests from communist aggression. The chances of this vote taking place would have been slim to none if the Soviet Union had been there, because everyone knew that the Soviet Union would have vetoed any decision to go in with military force against a communist country, the North Koreans. But because the Soviet Union had boycotted the Security Council based on the decision to recognize Taiwan, the United States was able to effectively gain a consensus in the United Nations to send an international force into South Korea to defend against communist aggression. Now, I say a UN force. Essentially, it was an American force, although all sorts of other countries, including Canada, New Zealand, Greece, and dozens of others, sent both military, economic aid to South Korea in this effort, and sent troops as well. It was largely an American force under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, who, really not surprisingly, came up with quite a successful military strategy to sneak in behind communist forces close to the 38th parallel and launch a massive counterattack, which was actually more successful than I think even MacArthur really thought it was going to be. And before too long, the United States and their United Nations allies had pushed North Korean communist troops back to the 38th parallel. Now, as far as Harry Truman, the U.S. president at the time, was concerned, the mission had been accomplished. Harry Truman was absolutely committed to a policy of containment. Now, let's pause on the Korean War and just try to figure out what was going on with this containment policy. One of Truman's close advisors, a man named George Kennan, who was a Soviet expert, believed that communism was essentially a flawed system, that it was not going to work. And so his question, and Truman I think shared this question, was, would it be worth it for the United States to risk American lives and risk countless millions or even billions of dollars to go launch an attack against communism if the system was inherently flawed and was going to burn itself out anyway? As far as Harry Truman was concerned, there was no point in going to attack communism because it would die off on its own. Rather, said Kennan, we should treat it like a disease and just quarantine it, just contain it. Now, Truman was 100% committed to the idea of letting communism exist on its own and just not letting it spread and waiting patiently for it to die. So, when MacArthur, getting back to Korea, had pushed North Korean troops back to the 38th parallel, as far as Truman was concerned, the mission had been accomplished. We had contained communism back to its original border. However, this was such a successful counterattack that troops under MacArthur's leadership continued to push the North Koreans back almost to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. And suddenly, things began to change, because the Chinese did not appreciate an enormous American force on the border with communist mainland China. And so the Chinese sent in hundreds of thousands of what they claimed to be volunteer troops, but it's hard to know in a communist country exactly who's doing things voluntarily. And at any rate, the American troops were certainly not prepared for such a massive counterattack by the Red Chinese forces. MacArthur decided that this was not a big deal, that we could regroup and that we could counterattack and take this opportunity not just to liberate North Korea from communist rule, but actually cross our border, the Chinese border, and liberate mainland China from the communist regime. Truman, obviously, being committed to containment, thought that this was absolutely a crazy idea, that going to war against the country with the largest population on Earth would be a quagmire that would take years, if not decades, to finally resolve. Truman disagreed because at the time, the United States was still the only country in the world with an atomic bomb. Even when the Soviet Union developed their own atomic bomb, MacArthur was very, very skeptical that the Soviet Union would be willing to risk a worldwide nuclear war to defend their allies in China and North Korea. China certainly did not have a nuclear bomb. Now, to put that in perspective, or to really explain it, what MacArthur was essentially advocating was using American military force not to contain communism, but to go and attack it. Now that's a problem because Truman disagrees with that policy right from the beginning. But to make matters even scarier, MacArthur had no reservations about this because he believed that if push came to shove and the war dragged on or the Chinese put up too much resistance, we could solve that very easily by simply dropping atomic bombs on China. This was considered absolutely insane by Harry Truman. Now, it's understood that the president and the military leadership of our country have disagreements probably on a daily basis, and who knows what they say to each other behind closed doors. I would imagine that many presidents have been either directly or indirectly insulted during meetings with leaders of our military, and that's okay because it's behind closed doors. What General Douglas MacArthur did was went to the United States press and gave interviews in which he essentially insulted Harry Truman, basically described him as being essentially a coward, and said that he was afraid to deal with the communists the way they needed to be dealt with. Truman is in a bad situation here because MacArthur is a very popular general, and MacArthur is essentially pandering to, I think, an inherent American desire to be the strongest, most powerful country in the world. And so the idea of retreating back to the 38th parallel was not just anathema to MacArthur, it really rubbed a lot of Americans the wrong way. At the same time, as president, Truman could not set a precedent in which he allows U.S. military leadership to insult the executive in public on a regular basis. And so, after I would imagine much hand-wringing, Truman decided that the best thing to do would be to relieve MacArthur of his command and put U.S. military leadership under the direct order to retreat back to the 38th parallel. MacArthur was essentially fired in disgrace in some ways, but emerged from this whole episode as a national hero, the American who was willing to stand up to the communists. Truman, on the other hand, looks like the cowardly or weak American leader who's backing down from the communists and allowing communist infiltration to continue to take place at a worldwide level. And so we come to another fork in the road of historical opinion. In many people's opinions, the United States did not win the Korean War because at the end of the conflict, the communists still existed, North Korea was still a communist country. However, if we look at this through the lens of what Harry Truman's containment policy was, it could be argued that the United States actually won the Korean War. If our mission was to contain communism in the 38th parallel, at the end of the war we had done just that. And that leads to the final sort of perplexing element of this story, which is that this is one of the few times in history that an American president won a war, if we assume that Harry Truman did win by containing communism, and yet did not win re-election. In fact, Harry Truman was so unpopular as a result of his decision to fire MacArthur that he chose not to even run for re-election. He knew that he had no chance of winning. And sure enough, the Republicans in the election of 1952 were swept to power, and their candidate, World War II hero, military hero, someone who would hopefully not back down from communist aggression, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was elected President of the United States starting in 1953.